a look at one of the pillars of modern monetary theory. What exactly is the purpose of taxes? So if you're like me, having to file my taxes each year is an arduous and time-consuming task that I usually try to put off until the last minute. The annoyance and complexity that comes with filing taxes is just a microcosm for why many people choose to completely ignore or refuse to learn about how our banking and monetary systems function. But in doing so, we are allowing those in power to use that complexity for their own gain by disguising the truth rather than reveal it. To quote Henry Ford, "It is perhaps well enough that the people of the nation do not know or understand our banking and monetary systems. For if they did, I believe there would be a revolution tomorrow morning." With this sentiment in mind, the first video we will look at is a talk by Dr. Stephanie Kelton that she gave in 2018 explaining what exactly is the purpose of taxes. Dr. Kelton begins by explaining the flaw in the reasoning behind the initial instinct to say that taxes are to help pay for what we want. Dr. Kelton describes how this belief that the government must collect taxes in order to remain solvent and run day-to-day operations is just simply wrong, and it isn't some new kind of realization.
So I think progressives should ask themselves, what is the purpose of a tax? What is the purpose of a tax? And if your instinct, if your impulse is to say, to pay for the stuff we want, my suggestion is you're doing it wrong. Okay? You're getting it wrong. This is something that, interestingly enough, a former head of the New York Federal Reserve Bank, can you imagine Geithner doing this when he was head of the New York Fed? I can't. But back in the day, in the 1940s, the New York Federal Reserve Bank was headed by a guy named Beardsley Ruml. And Beardsley Ruml wrote this really important piece, 1946, called "Taxes for Revenue Are Obsolete." So what's he saying? Well, here's a quote. I don't know that I need to read the whole thing, but he says, basically, the need for the government to raise taxes in order to remain solvent and run its affairs is completely like yesterday. We don't do that anymore. Why? Because we have a central bank and because we went off the gold standard. And the fact that we changed the monetary system in this fundamental way opens up space for us to do stuff we couldn't do before when we had to find the money. Somebody says, where are you going to find the money? They're really asking you to look on the, there's a pile of money somewhere, somebody find it. Or, like Robin Hood, there's gold out there. You can rob the rich. You're trapped in a gold standard framework when you're operating in this frame of mind that money is a finite thing that exists somewhere. It's physical, and you got to find it, and then you got to go get it in order to spend it. Rawls says, no. That's not how it works in the modern era. And by the way, modern in the 1940s. Right? And we still haven't caught up with this reality. So Ruml goes on to say the purpose of the tax is not to fund the federal government. The purpose of the tax is, multifold. One important thing it does is it allows the government to remove some money from the economy so that you don't overheat the economy through government spending. So in other words, taxes help you keep a lid on inflation. If you just spent money into the economy but you didn't tax anything back, you'd run the risk of overspending, overheating the economy, and causing an inflation problem. Another thing taxes do is they affect the distribution of income. You lower taxes on some folks, they end up with more take-home pay, higher disposable income. You raise taxes on others, you take some money away. You impact the distribution of income. And you use taxes to incentivize or disincentivize behavior. Carbon tax is a good example. You don't want as much pollution, you don't want certain activities taking place, put a tax on it. You want to encourage certain other things, like people driving electric cars, give a tax incentive, right? Some form of a subsidy to encourage that. And the last one is, he says you might want, for some reason or another, to have a line item where you can keep track of a certain program, like, for example, Social Security or the Highway Trust Fund or something like that. So taxes do a lot of stuff that's important. What they don't do is provide the government with revenue that it needs in order to operate.
Back in 1946, the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, Beardsley Ruml, explained that due to the central bank and going off of the gold standard, changed the monetary system, which allowed the government to do things they had never been able to do before. So saying, how will we find the money to pay for it, is just being stuck in a gold standard way of thinking, saying money is some finite thing that is physical and needs to be found in order to spend it. Ruml concluded that the purpose of the tax was not to fund the federal government, but rather to remove some money from the economy to keep a lid on inflation, affect the distribution of income, incentivize or disincentivize behavior, and finally to keep track of certain programs like Social Security. Kelton goes on to explain the rationale behind taxing the rich and Wall Street. Kelton explains that we don't tax the rich in order to be able to provide social safety net programs or infrastructure. The rich are taxed because the extreme concentration of wealth is not only immoral, but also bad for the function of the economy and for democracy. She goes on to explain how the same premise of discouraging certain behaviors is used to rationalize taxing Wall Street.
All right. So, go back to this picture. You don't tax the rich because you need their money in order to feed a hungry kid or fix a crumbling bridge. You tax the rich because they are too damn rich. And extreme concentrations of wealth, especially, but also income, are bad for the functioning of the economy, are bad for democracy, right? That's the rationale for taxing the rich, not because you can't do other things unless and until you can get money from them to pay for it. You tax Wall Street speculation because you want to discourage certain behaviors, not because you need their money that you raise from a financial transactions tax in order to pay for free college. Think it through. Suppose you said, we're going to make public colleges and universities tuition free in the US. It's going to cost about $70 billion a year to do that. All right? Now, to pay for it, we're going to put a tax on Wall Street. So every time somebody buys stocks or engages in derivatives trading or bond trading, they're going to pay a small a transactions tax. That's our tax. Okay. So now you simultaneously have said you want to break up the banks, you want to make banking boring, you want to shrink the size of the financial sector, and you have made yourself completely dependent upon what in order to fund your education proposal? Wall Street speculation. So not only do you need Wall Street to continue to speculate, but you're going to need them to do more of it over time and grow because of the amount of money needed to pay for college is going to grow. So you don't want to hitch your wagon to the very thing that you loathe and are trying to shrink as part of the overall economy. So, but there is a rationale for doing it, right? And that would be to discourage certain behaviors, not to fund programs.
Kelton goes on to break down the flawed view of TAB, or taxes and borrowing. It is believed that the government prearranges financing by collecting taxes and selling bonds in order to arrange the financing and raising of revenue. Then, only after that, can they go out and spend money last. So it's time for a little reality check. Here's a quick little lesson in the jobs of the federal government. First off, for anyone out there, maybe, a U.S. senator, who might not know the three branches of government, they are the executive, the judicial, and the legislative. So the legislative branch decides on a budget, and if it's passed, it's signed off by the executive branch. Only then does the appropriations process allow the spending to be triggered. The government spends first, and then taxes and borrowing takes place second.
We want to go out and buy a car tomorrow. We have to have the money in the bank or be able to prearrange the financing. The dealership is not going to let us drive off the lot with a car until we have secured the financing to pay for the car, right? So what these letters here are, the TAB is taxes and borrowing. Okay, what we think is that the government prearranges its financing, that it collects taxes from the rest of us, that it engages in borrowing when it sells bonds, it arranges the financing, it raises the revenue, it has money, and now it goes out and spends. The spending comes last. That's completely backwards. What happens in reality is that the federal government, House, Senate, get a budget together. If the budget passes, there's an appropriations process. It is through the appropriations process, the budget authorization, that the government spending is triggered. That's how the government pays for everything. Budgetary authorization, or sometimes an omnibus or a continuing resolution, right? That's what happens. We spend first, and the taxes and borrowing are secondary. They happen later. The rest of us can't do this. Money matters. And the fact that the federal government has control of the US dollar, creates it, issues it, is the sole source of the US dollar, can never run out of money. I said the currency, not other types of money things denominated in dollars. The currency itself is clearly, you could try to create it, but you get arrested for counterfeiting. You can't do it. You can't create high-powered money either. All right, so the government's money is special. So how should progressives answer the question, how will you pay for it? It's a trap. It's a trap. Don't fall into this, okay? Here's a perfect example. Here's a senator who is learning to avoid this trap. This is Senator Brian Schatz from Hawaii. He's put forward legislation for what he's calling debt-free college. He did an interview with Fox recently. They said, how are you going to pay for it? And he said, I reject the idea that only progressive ideas have to be paid for. We can work on it as we go through the process, but I think it's a trap. And it is. And he's right not to want to answer it. It's a trap. What they're really asking is not how will you pay for it, but who will pay for it. So the question is designed to get you to name the enemy. Who's going to be footing the bill? In other words, who's paying the tab? TAB, right? Who's paying the tab? Don't answer that question.
Kelton concludes the video by debunking various myths that are used to attack her argument regarding the purpose of taxes. Kelton explains that one of the favorite myths regarding who will pay for it is a trap question used by so-called deficit hawks to pick apart progressive ideas. They're not really asking how you will pay for it, but who will pay for it. This is the question that is designed to get you to label who will have to foot the bill. The whole premise of how to pay for it is built around the idea that deficits are bad. Deficits do matter, but not because of fear over adding to the national debt or feared instability, but rather the fact that deficits create surpluses somewhere else in the economy. So think about it. If the so-called deficit hawks are fine with it, then why can they be considered a bad thing? The 2017 tax cuts added over $1 trillion into the deficit. The Republicans that passed it knew that when the government increases their deficit, then other areas of their agendas will receive a surplus of financial resources. So if deficits are good to ensure tax breaks for billionaires, then they should be just fine to give some people some damn health care.
It's perfectly reasonable to say, look, we're talking about a sixth of the U.S. economy. We're talking about a healthcare system that is the most expensive in the world, where we spend around $10,000 per capita. The next closest to us is Canada, at closer to $6,000 per capita. If we move to a more efficient healthcare system, Medicare for all or something like that, we're talking about eliminating the middlemen and the entire apparatus that goes with it. It's a huge hit, I think, to the U.S. economy, because you're taking all kinds of economic activity and pushing it out. So, I've kind of half tongue-in-cheek said you might need tax cuts to pay for Medicare for all.
As you can see, once again, Dr. Kelton eloquently breaks down such a crucial pillar of MMT. Kelton is able to break through the perceived complexity of our banking and monetary system in order to reveal so many truths regarding the true intent and purposes of taxes. Essentially, the government is the source of money. They don't need it from us, but rather we need it from them. Dr. Kelton is able to explain a bold progressive message that also resonates with fiscally conservative audience as well. This just goes to show that modern monetary theory is not partisan, but rather a way for those who have been left behind to achieve true economic justice. That is our goal here at Real Progressives. We want to weaponize knowledge in order to equip and empower those who have been overlooked and oppressed with the tools that they need to understand how macroeconomics affects their lives every single day. So if you enjoyed this episode, make sure to check us out at realprogressives.org and subscribe to get notifications on our new video streams in YouTube, Periscope, Facebook, and Rockfin. Thank y'all and have a great week.